The air was crisp, and the golden leaves of autumn crunched under my boots as I stepped into the garage. It was one of those Saturdays when I had the urge to clean, not just the house but everything around me. My husband, Mark, had left his car in the driveway, its interior a chaotic reminder of the late night he'd had with his friends. I'd let it slide when he stumbled in at 2 in the morning, mumbling something about drinking too much and crashing on the couch before making his way to bed. Today, though, I couldn't ignore the mess. Empty fast food wrappers littered the seats, and the faint smell of beer hung in the air. Sighing, I rolled up my sleeves and began pulling things out, one by one. A crumpled receipt, a few loose coins, and then it. At first, I didn't even register what I was holding. My fingers brushed against soft fabric, pulling out a delicate, lace-trimmed handkerchief, faintly scented with perfume. It wasn't mine. I froze, staring at it as if it might explain itself. The lace was intricate. The monogram on the corner read, A. My heart began to pound in my chest, a slow, suffocating rhythm that echoed in the stillness of the garage. I clutched the handkerchief tighter, my mind racing. Who did this belong to? Why was it here? Memories flooded back. Mark laughing with his friends, his phone lighting up at odd hours, and his sudden late nights at work. Had I been blind? My throat tightened as I climbed the steps back into the house, clutching the handkerchief like it was evidence in a crime scene. Mark was in the living room, lounging on the couch with a bowl of chips, the TV blaring some sports channel. He looked up, his expression casual and unassuming, until he saw the look on my face. "What's wrong?" he asked, sitting up. I didn't speak at first. Instead, I walked over to him, holding the handkerchief out in front of me like an accusation. "What's this?" His eyes flicked to the delicate fabric, and for a moment I saw it, the flicker of recognition, the panic that flashed through his expression before he masked it. "Where did you find that?" he asked, his voice too calm. "In your car," I said, my voice trembling. "Mark, whose is it?" He rubbed the back of his neck, his eyes darting away from mine. "Oh, that," he said with a nervous chuckle. "It's nothing. Probably one of the guy's girlfriends left it. You know how messy those nights get." I stared at him, my chest tightening. One of the guy's girlfriends? Really? And you just happened to not notice something like this in your car? He sighed, leaning back against the couch. "Look, I had too much to drink, okay? We went out after the game, things got a little wild. Someone must have left it behind when they got a ride. That's all." I wanted to believe him. I really did. But the pieces didn't add up. The monogrammed E, the floral perfume. It felt too intimate, too personal to be something casually left behind. My mind played cruel tricks on me, imagining Mark with someone else, laughing, touching. My stomach churned. "Mark, are you lying to me?" My voice cracked, tears threatening to spill over. "Because if you are, I need to know now." He stood, crossing the room to stand in front of me. His hands reached for mine, but I pulled back. "I'm not lying, Claire," he said softly, his voice steady. "You're overthinking this. I swear it's nothing." But it didn't feel like nothing. It felt like the ground beneath my feet was crumbling, leaving me grasping for answers that he wasn't willing to give. The silence stretched between us, heavy and suffocating. He stared at me with those eyes I used to trust so completely, and for the first time in our marriage, I didn't know if I could believe him. I held up the handkerchief again, my voice trembling. "If this is nothing, Mark, then explain why it smells like perfume. Explain why it's monogrammed. Explain why I feel like I don't even know you anymore." He hesitated just for a moment, but it was enough. Enough to shatter whatever fragile hope I had left. "Claire," he began, but I cut him off. "No," I said, my voice rising. "Don't Claire me. Don't stand there and tell me I'm imagining things when everything about this feels wrong." He ran a hand through his hair, frustration etched across his face. "What do you want me to say? That I made a mistake? Fine. I drank too much, I wasn't thinking straight. And now you're blowing this out of proportion." "Blowing this out of proportion?" I repeated, my voice shaking with anger. "Do you even hear yourself? You're not even trying to explain it. You're just deflecting, like this is some minor inconvenience instead of our marriage on the line." He sighed again, turning away from me. "I can't do this right now," he muttered, heading toward the door. "Mark." I called after him, but he didn't stop. The door slammed shut. leaving me alone with the handkerchief and the suffocating weight of doubt. That night I sat on the couch, staring at the little piece of fabric that had upended my world. My mind cycled through every possible scenario, each one worse than the last. I wanted to believe him, to trust that this was just a misunderstanding. But the gnawing feeling in my gut wouldn't let me rest. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat in the darkness, waiting for answers I wasn't sure I'd ever get. The hours dragged by like an eternity, each second heavier than the last. The house was silent except for the occasional creak of the old wooden floors. I sat curled up on the couch, my knees pulled to my chest, the handkerchief still clutched tightly in my fist. My mind raced in endless circles. Every memory of Mark seemed tainted now. Every smile and laugh from the past decade warped into something I couldn't trust. How many times had I dismissed his late nights, his vague excuses? How many times had I told myself he was different, that he was loyal, that he was mine? The thought was unbearable. I needed answers, but Mark was nowhere to be found. He hadn't returned since storming out, and his absence felt like an answer in itself. If he had nothing to hide, wouldn't he have stayed to reassure me? Wouldn't he have fought for us? When the first light of dawn crept through the blinds, I finally forced myself to move. My body ached from the hours of tension, my head pounding from the tears I'd shed in the quiet darkness. I couldn't sit here any longer, drowning in uncertainty. I had to do something, even if it felt like prying into a part of Mark's life I was afraid to uncover. I went back to the car. The chill of the morning air bit at my skin as I opened the driver's side door and slid into the seat. The handkerchief had been the first clue, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more. I began searching with a frantic intensity, opening the glove compartment, rifling through the center console, checking under the seats. First it seemed fruitless. Crumpled receipts and empty gum wrappers were all I could find. But then, tucked beneath the passenger seat, I felt something. A small object wrapped in tissue paper. My hands trembled as I pulled it out. The tissue was crumpled and slightly torn, revealing a delicate silver bracelet with a tiny charm in the shape of a heart. My stomach twisted into knots. This wasn't mine. I had never seen it before, and yet here it was, hidden in Mark's car like some damning secret. The bracelet was simple but elegant, the kind of thing a woman might treasure if it came from someone she cared about. My breathing grew shallow as I stared at it, the pieces in my mind falling together like jagged shards of glass. The handkerchief, the perfume, the bracelet, each one felt like another nail in the coffin of my trust, another weight dragging me down into the abyss of betrayal. I placed the bracelet on the dashboard, my fingers trembling as I grabbed my phone. I needed answers, and if Mark wasn't going to give them to me willingly, I'd find them myself. I started scrolling through his call history, his text messages. Mark wasn't the type to delete things. He'd always been careless with his phone, assuming I'd never have a reason to look. But now I was determined to find the truth, no matter how much it hurt. And there it was. A string of messages from a number I didn't recognize. At first glance, they seemed innocuous, short exchanges about meeting up, vague mentions of last night, and can't stop thinking about it. My heart hammered in my chest as I opened the conversation, my eyes scanning the words with growing horror. Thank you for last night. I needed that more than you know. You're amazing. I wish we had more time together. Don't forget your bracelet. I'll keep it safe for you. I dropped the phone as if it had burned me, my vision blurring with tears. The messages were dated over the past few weeks, each one a dagger to my heart. This wasn't some misunderstanding, some harmless accident. This was deliberate, calculated. Mark had been meeting someone else, sharing moments with her that were meant to be ours. I sat there, the cold metal of the bracelet glinting in the weak morning light, and felt something inside me break. This was the man I had built my life with, the man I had trusted with everything. And now he was a stranger, someone I didn't recognize, someone who could smile in my face while betraying me behind my back. By the time I heard the sound of Mark's car pulling into the driveway, I had gone numb. He walked into the house a few minutes later, his hair disheveled, his clothes wrinkled as if he'd spent the night in the same outfit. When he saw me standing in the living room, the bracelet in one hand and his phone in the other, he froze. "Claire," he started, his voice cautious, but I cut him off. "Don't," I said, my voice cold and steady in a way that surprised even me. "Don't lie to me, Mark. I know everything. His face paled, the confidence and charm he usually carried with him slipping away like a mask. Claire, it's not what you think. Not what I think. I snapped, holding up the phone. You've been meeting her. Messaging her. Hiding her things in your car. How dare you stand there and act like this is some misunderstanding? He opened his mouth but no words came out. Instead, he lowered his head. His silence confirming everything I already knew. I felt a fresh wave of tears rising but I forced them back. I didn't want him to see me cry. I didn't want him to know how deeply he'd shattered me. Why, Mark? I asked, my voice trembling. Why would you do this to us? To me? He looked up then, his eyes filled with a mix of guilt and desperation. I don't know, he said finally. I was stupid. I made a mistake. A mistake. I repeated bitterly. A mistake is forgetting to take out the trash. This is a choice. You chose her over me. Over everything we've built. I didn't choose her, he said, his voice rising. It didn't mean anything. It was just, I don't know, Claire. I wasn't thinking. I stared at him, the man I had loved for so long, and felt nothing but emptiness. His excuses, his apologies, they meant nothing. The damage was done. The trust was gone, and with it, the foundation of our marriage. I need you to leave, I said finally, my voice breaking. Claire, please, he said, stepping toward me, but I held up my hand to stop him. Leave, Mark. I can't look at you right now. I need time to think. He hesitated, his eyes searching mine for some sign of forgiveness, but I had nothing left to give. After a moment, he turned and walked out the door, leaving me alone in the silence of the house we had once called home. The door closed behind him with a heavy final thud. I stood in the silence, the phone and bracelet still in my hands, the weight of everything crushing down on me. The tears I had been holding back finally spilled over, hot and unrelenting, as I sank onto the couch. My chest heaved with sobs, and it felt like I might drown in the sheer enormity of my pain. How had it come to this? How had the man who once looked at me like I was his entire world managed to destroy mine so completely? I thought back to the beginning, to the Mark I had fallen in love with all those years ago. He had been charming, funny, and endlessly kind. He would leave me little notes in my bag, surprise me with flowers for no reason, and stay up late talking with me about our dreams for the future. I had trusted him with every part of me, believing that we were unshakable, that no matter what life threw at us, we would face it together. Now it all felt like a lie. Every sweet moment, every shared laugh, it was all tarnished by the knowledge of his betrayal. I sat there for hours, lost in the storm of my emotions. At times, I felt anger bubbling to the surface, hot and explosive, demanding action. I wanted to scream at him, to throw something, to make him feel even a fraction of the pain he had caused me. Other times, the anger gave way to despair, leaving me hollow and exhausted. The man I had loved was gone, replaced by someone I didn't recognize, someone who had hurt me in ways I hadn't thought possible. Eventually, the sunlight streaming through the window began to fade, and the house grew darker around me. I forced myself to move, setting the bracelet and phone on the coffee table before heading upstairs to the bedroom. The bed we had shared felt foreign now, the sheets still carrying his scent, a cruel reminder of what I had lost. I grabbed a spare blanket and pillow and retreated to the guest room, unable to bear the thought of sleeping in the same space where we had once whispered our dreams to each other. That night, sleep eluded me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the messages, heard the phantom echoes of their conversations. Who was she? Did she know he was married? Did she care? The questions swirled in my mind, each one more painful than the last. I wondered if she was younger than me, prettier, more exciting. Was it my fault? Had I failed him in some way? The thought made me sick, but it was impossible to shake. The next morning, the house felt unbearably empty. I moved through the motions of making coffee and tidying up, but everything felt hollow. My phone buzzed on the counter and I flinched, half expecting it to be Mark. Instead, it was my best friend Laura checking in. She had a knack for sensing when something was wrong, and I hesitated before typing a reply. Can you come over? I need to talk. She responded almost immediately. Be there in 20. When Laura arrived, she took one look at me and knew. Claire, she said softly, pulling me into a hug. What happened? The words spilled out of me in a rush, Finding the handkerchief, the bracelet, the messages, and Mark's weak excuses. By the time I was done, tears were streaming down my face again, and Laura's expression had hardened into one of protective fury. "That bastard," she said, her voice low and angry. "I can't believe he did this to you. I just don't understand," I said, my voice trembling. "Why wasn't I enough? We were happy, weren't we?" "This isn't about you," Laura said firmly, taking my hands in hers. "This is about him. He's the one who broke your trust, who made the choice to hurt you. Don't you dare blame yourself for his mistakes." Her words were a balm, but they didn't erase the ache in my chest. "What do I do now?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Laura hesitated, her gaze steady. "That's up to you," she said gently. "You don't have to decide everything right now. Take some time to figure out what you want. But whatever you do, don't let him manipulate you into thinking this is your fault." We spent the rest of the day together, Laura refusing to leave my side. She helped me pack up some of Mark's things, stuffing them into a box and leaving it by the front door. "If he comes back," she said, "he can take this and go. You don't owe him anything right now." That evening, as the house grew quiet again, I sat in the living room, staring at the box of Mark's belongings. It felt surreal, like I was watching someone else's life unravel. The man I had built my life around was gone, and I was left with the shards of what once was. Days turned into weeks, and I began to find a new rhythm, one without Mark. At first it was agonizing, every small reminder of him a fresh wound. But slowly, I started to reclaim pieces of myself that I had forgotten. I went for long walks, reconnected with old friends, and threw myself into work. Laura was a constant presence, her unwavering support a lifeline in my darkest moments. Mark called a few times, leaving messages that ranged from tearful apologies to angry demands for me to stop punishing him. I didn't respond. I couldn't. Every time I heard his voice, it brought back the pain, the betrayal, the image of that bracelet gleaming in the light. One evening, as I was sorting through old photos, I came across one of the two of us from our honeymoon. We looked so happy, so full of hope for the future. I stared at it for a long time before placing it in a box with the rest of our memories. It was time to let go, to start rebuilding my life without him. The process was slow and painful, but with each passing day, I felt a little stronger. I wasn't sure what the future held, but I knew one thing for certain. I deserved better. I deserved honesty, loyalty, and a love that didn't come with conditions or betrayals. Mark had taken so much from me, but he hadn't taken everything. I still had myself, and that was enough to start again. Weeks turned into months, and the raw agony of those first few days began to dull, replaced by a cautious sense of clarity. Life without Mark was strange, like living in a house that had once been bustling with noise and energy but now stood eerily quiet. Yet, in that silence I found something unexpected myself. For so long my identity had been wrapped up in being his wife, in supporting his dreams, in building a life that revolved around us. Now I was rediscovering who I was on my own. I threw myself into work, taking on projects I had been hesitant to tackle before. My boss noticed, offering me a promotion that came with more responsibility and a significant pay raise. It was bittersweet. Mark had always been the one I celebrated these milestones with, but I reminded myself that this was my achievement, mine alone. In the evenings, I started exploring hobbies I'd long neglected. Painting, something I hadn't done since college, became my therapy. I turned the spare bedroom into a makeshift studio, filling the walls with canvases splashed with vibrant colors. Each stroke felt like a release, a way to express the emotions I couldn't always put into words. Sometimes the paintings were dark, shadowy depictions of pain and loss. Other times they were bright and chaotic, reflecting the glimmers of hope I felt creeping back into my life. Laura was my rock through it all, checking in regularly, dragging me out of the house when I felt the pull of isolation. She refused to let me wallow, insisting we try new things together. A pottery class, hiking trails, even a salsa dance lesson that ended in fits of laughter as we stumbled over our feet. "You're allowed to have fun, you know," she'd say, her eyes full of warmth. "You're allowed to be happy again." It wasn't always easy. There were still moments when the pain would hit me out of nowhere. Like when I'd pass a couple holding hands or hear a song that Mark and I had danced to at our wedding. Those moments felt like setbacks, pulling me back into the whirlpool of grief and anger. But each time I reminded myself that healing wasn't a straight line. It was messy, unpredictable, and painfully slow, but I was moving forward. One day, while cleaning out the last of Mark's things, I stumbled upon an old journal he'd given me during our first year of marriage. Inside were pages filled with notes from both of us. Dreams for the future, plans for vacations, silly doodles we'd drawn together. My breath caught as I flipped through it, the weight of those memories pressing down on me. For a moment I considered throwing it away, but something stopped me. Instead, I placed it in a box with other mementos I wasn't ready to part with, tucking it away in the attic. Maybe one day I'd revisit it, but not now. Not yet. Mark, for his part, had tried to reach out a few more times, each attempt more desperate than the last. His messages swung wildly between regret and defensiveness, as if he couldn't decide whether to beg for forgiveness or justify his actions. I didn't respond. I had nothing left to say to him. Our marriage had been built on trust, and once that was gone, there was no foundation left to stand on. It wasn't until a particularly cold evening in early December that I finally saw him again. I was leaving the grocery store, bundled up in a thick coat, when I spotted him across the parking lot. He looked different, thinner, his face etched with lines that hadn't been there before. Our eyes met briefly, and for a moment I thought he might walk over. But he didn't. Instead, he gave me a small, almost apologetic nod before turning and walking away. I stood there for a long time, the cold biting at my cheeks, until I realized that I didn't feel the ache I had expected. Seeing him didn't break me. It didn't unravel the progress I had made. If anything, it reaffirmed that I was stronger now, that I had rebuilt parts of myself that he could no longer touch. That night, I lit a candle and sat in my living room, sipping tea and watching the snow fall outside. The world felt quiet, peaceful in a way it hadn't in a long time. I thought about the person I had been a year ago, the woman who had found that handkerchief and felt her entire world crumble. She was still a part of me, but she wasn't all of me. I had grown since then, endured more than I thought I could, and come out the other side. As the snow blanketed the world in white, I made a silent promise to myself. I would keep moving forward, keep rebuilding, keep finding joy in the small, beautiful moments of life. Because no matter what had happened, I was still here. I was still standing. And for the first time in a long time, I believed that was enough. The days grew shorter as winter tightened its grip, each morning greeted by frost on the windows and a chill in the air that seemed to seep into everything. Yet, despite the cold, I found myself feeling lighter, freer than I had in months. The pain of Mark's betrayal hadn't disappeared. No, it still lingered like a bruise that refused to fade, but it no longer consumed me. Instead, it had become a quiet hum in the background of my life, a reminder of what I'd endured and the strength I'd discovered in its wake. My painting had taken on a life of its own. What had started as a form of therapy had turned into something much more. Laura, ever the cheerleader, had convinced me to submit a few pieces to a local art gallery that hosted monthly showcases for amateur artists. First, I balked at the idea. Who would want to see my work? But Laura wouldn't take no for an answer, and before I knew it, she had sent off the submission forms on my behalf. When I received the email a few weeks later confirming that 2 of my pieces had been accepted, I was stunned. "See," Laura said triumphantly when I told her. "I told you people would love your work. You're amazing, Claire. It's time you start believing it." The showcase was scheduled for mid-January, and the thought of putting myself out there filled me with equal parts excitement and terror. The gallery was a small, intimate space downtown, nestled between a coffee shop and a bookstore. On the night of the event, I stood in front of my paintings, nervously fidgeting with the hem of my sweater as strangers wandered through the room, pausing to admire the art on display. One of my pieces, a swirling blend of blues and purples titled Rebirth, seemed to draw the most attention. A few people even approached me to ask about its meaning, and as I spoke I realized how much of myself was embedded in the canvas. It was a representation of my journey, the storm of emotions I had navigated and the calm I had found on the other side. Toward the end of the evening, a man approached me, his hands tucked into the pockets of a well-worn coat. He was tall, with dark hair and a warm, open expression that immediately put me at ease. "This is yours, isn't it?" he asked, nodding toward Rebirth. I smiled nervously. "Yes, it is. It's incredible," he said, his voice genuine. "There's so much emotion in it. It's the kind of peace that makes you stop and think. Thank you, I said, feeling a blush creep into my cheeks. That means a lot. We fell into an easy conversation, and I learned his name was Ethan. He was a freelance photographer who had recently moved to the area, and he'd stumbled upon the gallery while exploring the neighborhood. There was something about him that felt different from anyone I'd met before. He was thoughtful, attentive, and seemed genuinely interested in what I had to say. By the end of the night, he had asked if I'd like to grab coffee sometime, and to my own surprise I said yes. Our first coffee date turned into a second and then a third. Ethan was easy to talk to, and he had a quiet confidence that put me at ease. He didn't push or pry, and when I eventually told him about Mark and everything I had been through, he listened without judgment. "You've been through a lot," he said softly, "but it sounds like you've come out stronger." His words stayed with me long after that evening, and as our relationship deepened, I found myself opening up to the possibility of love again. It wasn't easy. There were moments when fear and doubt crept in, whispering that it was too soon, that I wasn't ready. But Ethan was patient, never rushing me, always reminding me that I was in control of my own pace. As winter melted into spring, the world seemed to come alive again. The trees budded with new leaves, flowers began to bloom, and the air carried the promise of warmth and renewal. My life, too, felt like it was entering a new season. The pain of the past still lingered, but it no longer defined me. I had found joy in painting, in new friendships, in the simple pleasures of a walk in the park or a quiet evening spent reading. And in Ethan, I had found someone who saw me not as broken but as whole. One evening as we walked along the river, the city lights reflecting on the water, Ethan stopped and turned to me. "Claire," he said, his voice steady, "I know you've been through so much and I can't imagine how hard it must have been. But I want you to know that I'm here for you. Wherever this goes, whatever you need, I'm here." Tears filled my eyes, but this time they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of gratitude, of hope, of a heart that was slowly beginning to heal. "Thank you," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the sound of the river. In that moment I realized something profound. The pain I had endured hadn't destroyed me. It had shaped me, taught me lessons about strength, resilience, and the kind of love I deserved. And though I didn't know what the future held, I knew I was ready to embrace it, one step at a time. Life, with all its messiness and unpredictability, was still beautiful. And so was I. The days stretched into weeks, and spring bloomed into the vibrant warmth of summer. Each passing day felt like a small triumph, a reminder that I was no longer defined by the weight of betrayal, but by the choices I made for myself. My life had taken on a new rhythm, one filled with art, meaningful connections, and a growing sense of contentment. Ethan became a steady presence in my life. He was patient, thoughtful, and attentive in ways that felt effortless but spoke volumes. He never tried to fix me or dismiss the scars I carried. Instead, he treated them as part of who I was, neither diminishing their importance nor letting them overshadow the person I was becoming. I found comfort in his quiet strength, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I allowed myself to relax in someone else's presence. One afternoon, as we sat on a blanket in the park with a picnic spread between us, Ethan pulled out his camera. "I've been meaning to ask," he said, adjusting the lens. "Would you ever let me photograph you?" I blinked at him, surprised. "Me? Why?" He smiled, leaning back slightly to study me. "Because you're beautiful. And not just in the obvious way. There's something about you, this energy, this light. I see it when you talk about your art, when you laugh, even when you're lost in thought. I want to capture that." I felt my cheeks flush, unsure how to respond. It wasn't the kind of compliment I was used to, and it wasn't something I'd ever believed about myself. "I don't know," I said hesitantly. "I'm not really the camera type." Ethan grinned, a playful glint in his eye. "Let's try something low pressure. Just a few shots, nothing fancy. If you hate them, I'll delete them. Deal." His enthusiasm was infectious, and before I knew it, I found myself agreeing. He guided me gently, snapping photos as I lounged on the blanket, gazed up at the sky, or laughed at his silly jokes. It felt natural, almost easy, and when he showed me the images later, I was stunned. They weren't just pictures. They were a reflection of someone I barely recognized but wanted to know better. A woman who looked confident, radiant, and free. Those photos marked a turning point for me. They became a reminder that I was more than the sum of my pain, more than the woman who had been betrayed and left to rebuild. I started to see myself through a kinder lens, appreciating the strength it had taken to get to this point and the beauty and the vulnerability I had once been so afraid to show. As summer deepened, opportunities began to emerge. The gallery where I had showcased my first paintings invited me back for another exhibit, this time as a featured artist. I poured myself into creating new pieces, drawing inspiration from the world around me and the emotions I had learned to navigate. My work resonated with people in ways I hadn't anticipated, and for the first time, I began to consider the possibility of turning my passion into a career. Ethan was my biggest supporter, cheering me on at every turn. "You have a gift, Claire," he said one evening as he helped me hang a particularly large canvas in my studio. "You're meant to do this." His faith in me was unwavering, and it gave me the courage to dream bigger than I ever had before. I started applying for grants, exploring the idea of teaching art classes, and even connecting with other local artists to collaborate on projects. It felt like the beginning of something new, something entirely my own. But life, as I had learned, was rarely without its challenges. One late August evening, as I was tidying up my studio, my phone buzzed with a familiar number. Mark. The sight of his name on the screen sent a jolt through me, a mix of dread and curiosity. I hesitated for a long moment before answering. "Hello." My voice was cautious, guarded. "Claire," Mark said, his voice heavy with emotion. "I've been trying to reach you." "I know," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. "What do you want, Mark?" There was a pause, the sound of him exhaling deeply. I need to see you. Please. It's important." I closed my eyes, the memories of our last encounter flooding back. Part of me wanted to hang up, to refuse him the chance to stir up old wounds. But another part, the part that still sought closure, whispered that maybe this was a conversation I needed to have. "Fine," I said finally. "Tomorrow. Coffee shop on Main Street at 3. The next day I arrived early, my stomach churning with nerves. Mark was already there, sitting at a corner table with a cup of coffee in front of him. He looked older, more worn than I remembered, and there was a sadness in his eyes that hadn't been there before. "Claire," he said softly as I sat down. "Thank you for coming." I nodded, folding my hands in my lap. "What do you want, Mark?" He hesitated, his fingers fidgeting with the rim of his cup. "I wanted to apologize," he said finally. "For everything. For hurting you, for betraying your trust. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I needed to say it." His words hung in the air, heavy with regret. I studied him, searching for any sign of the man I had once loved. He looked sincere, but sincerity couldn't erase what had happened. "I appreciate the apology," I said carefully, "but it doesn't change anything. What you did broke something in me that I've had to work hard to rebuild." "I know," he said quickly, his voice pleading. "I've spent every day since you left trying to figure out how I could have been so selfish, so blind. I miss you, Claire. I miss us." His admission hit me like a wave, but instead of pulling me under, it washed over me and left me standing. I didn't feel anger or longing or even sadness. I felt nothing. The love I had once held for him, the pain he had caused, it was gone, replaced by a quiet sense of finality. "I've moved on, Mark," I said gently but firmly. "I've built a life for myself and I'm happy. I don't need you to fix anything and I don't need us to go back. What's done is done." He nodded slowly, his shoulders slumping in defeat. "I understand," he said quietly. "I'm glad you're happy. You deserve that." As I walked out of the coffee shop, the weight I hadn't realized I was still carrying seemed to lift. That chapter of my life was truly over, and I was free to step fully into the next. The sun was warm on my face as I walked down the street, a smile spreading across my lips. For the first time in years I felt whole. The sun was setting as I walked home, its warm golden rays casting a soft glow over the town. The coffee shop encounter felt like a closing door, the final piece of a story that no longer needed revisiting. With each step I felt lighter, as though some invisible chain that had been holding me back had finally snapped, leaving me free to move forward without looking over my shoulder. When I got home, the house greeted me with a sense of peace that had been missing for so long. It wasn't just a place anymore. It was mine, a reflection of the life I was building. I tossed my keys onto the kitchen counter and poured myself a glass of wine, letting the evening settle around me. Outside, the cicadas buzzed their late summer song, and the soft breeze carried the scent of freshly cut grass. It was a quiet, ordinary moment, but it felt profound in its simplicity. I had learned to treasure these small fragments of life, the ones that reminded me how far I had come. The next day I dove back into my work. The upcoming exhibit was just a few weeks away, and I was determined to make it my best yet. My studio had become my sanctuary, a space where I could lose myself in color and texture and emotion. Each painting told a story, not just of pain but of resilience, growth, and hope. I found myself pouring my heart into every stroke of the brush, creating pieces that felt raw and honest, pieces that spoke to who I was becoming. Ethan stopped by one afternoon, bringing coffee and a bouquet of wildflowers. "Thought you could use a break," he said with a smile, setting the flowers on the counter. I laughed, wiping paint from my hands. "You're the best, you know that?" "I try," he said, leaning against the doorway. His eyes wandered to the canvas I was working on, a swirling blend of fiery oranges and deep, moody blues. "This one's different," he said thoughtfully. "It feels powerful." "It's about letting go," I said, stepping back to study the piece. "About finding strength in the things we lose." Ethan nodded, his expression softening. "I think it's one of your best." We spent the afternoon together, talking and laughing as I worked. He had a way of making everything feel easy, his presence grounding me in a way I hadn't realized I needed. By the time he left, the painting was nearly finished, and my heart felt full in a way that still surprised me sometimes. I wasn't just surviving anymore, I was thriving, and it was a feeling I never wanted to take for granted. The weeks leading up to the exhibit were a blur of activity. Between preparing my pieces, coordinating with the gallery, and balancing my other responsibilities, there were moments when it all felt overwhelming. But through it all, I reminded myself of how far I'd come. This wasn't just about showcasing my work. It was about proving to myself that I could do this, that I was capable of creating a life that was entirely my own. The night of the exhibit arrived faster than I expected. The gallery was packed, the air buzzing with energy as people milled about, admiring the art on display. My section was near the back, a small but carefully curated collection of my latest work. As I stood there, greeting visitors and answering questions, I felt a mix of nerves and pride. This was my moment, and I was determined to savor it. Toward the end of the evening, a woman approached me, her eyes lingering on the painting I had titled Letting Go. She was older, with kind eyes and a gentle demeanor. "This piece," she said, her voice soft, "it speaks to me. It's like it's telling my story." I smiled, touched by her words. "Thank you. That means a lot." She glanced at me, her expression thoughtful. "Have you ever considered writing? Your work has a depth to it that feels like it's part of something bigger, like it's connected to words waiting to be written." I hadn't, not seriously, but her comment stuck with me. That night, as I sat in my quiet living room, I thought about what she had said. Painting had been my way of processing everything I'd been through, but maybe there were other ways to tell my story. The idea both excited and intimidated me, but I couldn't shake it. Perhaps this was another step in my journey, another way to explore who I was and who I wanted to be. Over the next few weeks, I started jotting down thoughts and memories, fragments of moments that had shaped me. At first, it felt awkward and disjointed, but the more I wrote, the more the words began to flow. It wasn't just about what had happened, it was about how I had changed, how I had grown, and the lessons I had learned along the way. Writing became a new form of therapy, a way to make sense of the pieces of my life and find meaning in the chaos. Ethan was endlessly supportive, encouraging me at every turn. "You've got something to say," he told me one evening as I showed him a few pages of what I'd written. "People need to hear it." His belief in me gave me the courage to keep going, and before long, I had a collection of essays and reflections that felt like a snapshot of my journey. Laura, of course, was my first reader. She devoured the pages in one sitting, her eyes brimming with tears when she looked up at me. "Claire, this is incredible," she said. "You have to share this with the world." I wasn't sure if I was ready for that, but the idea planted itself in my mind and began to grow. Maybe my story could help someone else, someone who felt lost or broken and needed to know they weren't alone. The thought gave me a sense of purpose, a way to turn my pain into something meaningful. Life continued to unfold in ways I hadn't anticipated. My art gained more recognition, leading to new opportunities and collaborations. My writing took on a life of its own, and I began submitting pieces to local publications, thrilled and surprised when a few of them were accepted. And through it all, Ethan remained by my side, a constant source of love and support. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sun dip below the horizon, Ethan reached for my hand. "You know," he said, his voice quiet but steady, "I've never met anyone like you. You're stronger than you realize, and watching you rebuild your life has been one of the most inspiring things I've ever seen." Tears prickled at the corners of my eyes, but they were tears of gratitude, not sadness. "I couldn't have done it without you," I said, squeezing his hand. "Yes, you could have," he replied, a soft smile playing on his lips. "But I'm glad I got to be here for it." As the sky faded into shades of pink and orange, I felt a deep sense of peace settle over me. My life was far from perfect, but it was mine, and it was beautiful in its imperfections. For the first time in a long time, I felt truly whole. As summer melted into fall, the warm golden days gave way to crisp mornings and the rich, earthy smell of leaves falling from the trees. Life had settled into a rhythm that felt like home. Art, writing, and the quiet joy of discovering who I was in this new chapter. Each day felt like another step away from the pain of the past and toward something brighter, something fuller. Ethan had become a central part of my world. His presence was steady and unwavering, but it was never suffocating. He gave me space when I needed it, encouraged me when I doubted myself, and celebrated even my smallest victories. One evening, as we cooked dinner together in my kitchen, he paused and looked at me, a soft smile on his face. "You know," he said, his voice carrying a hint of teasing, "I think this is the happiest I've ever seen you." I laughed, nudging him playfully. "You sure you're not just talking about the food? Because this lasagna smells amazing." He shook his head, his expression turning serious. "I mean it, Claire. You're glowing.